It was interesting to live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida when I did. We moved to Fort Lauderdale in 1967, and we would be there until the beginnings of 1970. And in the space of those 3 years, there was so much to see and so much to experience about that general area. You had Port Everglades, which was really kind of a neat place. There were really like warships there all the time. And for a while, the Queen Elizabeth was there. I always remember I went up there and there was this wall of steel and it was this monstrous ship. It was fascinating to see. And then, of course, she left and went to Hong Kong and sank. But that's another story altogether. None of the other things that were really interesting were the roadways. They were pretty simple at that time, and you had the Everglades. And at the time when we lived there, they had built the first roadway going through the Everglades. I forget what they called it, maybe the Everglades Parkway or something like that. And I remember driving on it. I remember how quiet it was because the road was brand new and it didn't make any noise. And as we drove in our 19 at that time, I think it was a 1962 Thunderbird. It's kind of fun. I remember we went to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and at that time it was so full of activity, because it was all the time of the Apollo missions, and we got to go in there and look around. And I remember that they had mock-ups of new ideas that would be taking place, and one of them was something called a space shuttle that they were talking about flying into space and returning. We also saw a mock-up of something brand new called the Boeing 747, which was this new monstrous jetliner that was just starting to be introduced, and they had a big model of it there at the Kennedy Space Center. And there was lots of things. I remember looking along and seeing the launching pad, and you could see the big building where they built the rockets. And at that time, I don't recall if the rocket had been moved out yet. I don't think it was when we went there. But we were very aware of everything going on at NASA because that was a big, monstrous deal at the time. It's hard to convey today, 50 plus years later, the absolute total absorption of our interest in space travel, in going to the moon. That was a big, big thing in our mind. And of course, living in Florida, I watched and I could see, I could step outside and I could see them taking off on their journeys. And I remember watching Apollo 11. That was a big deal. Everybody was outside watching. And little did I realize that many years later I would interview one of those astronauts, which was kind of a fascinating thing for me, like full circle, as it were. Other things about Fort Lauderdale at the time, you had all kinds of interesting little pockets of waterways and whatever, and lots of boats and yachts, and of course the beach. And the airport was fascinating. At the airport, it wasn't a monstrous airport at the time. If you go to the Fort Lauderdale airport today, it's this monstrous entity. At the time I lived there, it was quite a small airport. But what was really fascinating about it was the large amount of World War II and post-World War II aircraft. And all around the property of the airport, there were pockets of planes, old planes that were no longer flying. And I remember seeing many fighters from World War II and some fighters from the Korean War, lots of transports, a lot of cargo planes, the flying boxcars, B-25s, B-26s, And of course, there would be a lot of C-47s, which was the DC-3, which was the workhorse of World War II. They were everywhere. And there was another area where there were lots of planes that had long since stopped flying that were airliners. And Lockheed Constellation that was there. I remember seeing that. I remember how high it was and had these extremely long uh, areas holding it up, with the brackets with the wheels, because the propellers were so big. It needed to have that space, so it was way, way up in the air. And another plane sitting there was a Boeing Stratocruiser. And what this was, it was a basic B-29 bomber that they expanded in size and made it into an airliner, and it was the first airliner to go across the Atlantic, from the New World to the Old, and in a single flight without having to make stops. That was really amazing and important. That started in 1949. And there were DC-4s and, of course, DC-3s and DC-6s, DC-7s. And I used to sit there at the airport. It was so much fun to watch these planes take off. Like watching a DC-3 take off. It barely moved. And it made a racket. It was very loud, and then it just kind of took off. And I remember seeing a lot of those planes. In fact, in the 1960s, there were so many propeller planes around. And I'd hear them. I could see them from home. We used to look up in the air, and all the kids around there, we used to have little binoculars, and we'd sit there. We knew all the planes. We knew the sound of the planes. And at that time, it was the later 1960s, we would all ride around on our bikes, and I had a bike with monkey bars and a banana seat, which was a big thing at the time. And of course, we took baseball cards and held them in place with clothespins to make our bikes sound like motorcycles. It's a big thing then. And I remember even going to the 5 and 10 cent store and saving up and being able to buy a noisemaker for my bike that made it sound like it was a motorcycle. It was really kind of pathetic. And also I had a transistor radio, which I put on, and I can still remember riding my bicycle and listening to the radio and hearing from Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band, "What would you do if I sang out of tune?" I could still picture that, riding my bike, listening to that new and exciting song by the Beatles. Things have changed a lot over the years. I went to Fort Lauderdale just a couple of years ago, and there was hardly anything I recognized. The only thing I could recognize when I went there were the power plant. There were these 4 monstrous chimneys that were striped going down, but I have heard recently they've taken them down too. There was Pier 66, which was right by Port Everglades, which was a tall building that had a revolving top. I don't know what it's called now or if it even exists still. And of course, as I mentioned, everything going on in Fort Lauderdale was pretty fascinating at the time because there was so much going on in Florida at the time. I remember school. School was so different. The school I went to doesn't exist anymore either. In fact, the community I lived in doesn't exist anymore either as well. But I went to, I think it was called Riverland Elementary School. And it was different wings, and they were all separated and apart, and you had walkways going to each one because it was very hot. And we had these circular fans in the ceiling, and they used to mow the lawns in the area with these monstrous lawnmowers. And we had to do prayers every morning in school. This was elementary school. And the Pledge of Allegiance, of course. And of course, the other thing that was rather fascinating at that school is in the principal's office, there was a boat paddle. And if you acted up, you were taken to the principal's and paddled. I just can't imagine that kind of activity going on today. And a lot of times, if you got in trouble in school and got paddled at school with your parents' permission, you went home and it was even worse. But this is talking about a time that's so different from our own, well over a half century ago. And in the late 60s, an amazing period of time in Florida. And for me as a kid, you know, there's so many things I can mention, being with my friends and climbing trees and singing songs in the trees and going for little bike runs and riding here and there. So much, such a fascinating time. And I remember so much of it. And sometimes I just sit back and recall all of the various things that went on. And it was an amazing time to be there with Apollo, the old planes, and general life there. It's so different today. Go to Fort Lauderdale. It's nothing like it was back then. But then again, probably no place is just like it was 50 plus years ago.